Welcome to Mystic Realms Recap. Links are in the description below. Please show some love of the author and me. On to the show. With just this thought in mind, Charles's attitude changed drastically in a flash. He lowered his high-raised chin and bent down his straightened back humbly. His lofty and arrogant expression was replaced by shock and fear. In a trembling voice, he asked, "Sea Captain Sienna, can you please tell me who this esteemed Mr. Mage exactly is?" Sienna was afraid of that mage Felix from the bottom of his heart. Though Felix hadn't shown any signs of displeasure, Sienna knew very well that Felix could kill him easily with the tip of his finger. Whatever powerful emerging talent or top mercenary corp in Roland City was nothing to Mage Felix. A lich summoning a humorous WYRM was enough to destroy Sienna's entire mercenary corps, which he had so painstakingly built. Sienna hated Charles wholeheartedly. Although Sienna appeared to be polite all the time, he couldn't care less about the 7-leaf grass herb store once he was burdened by it. Seeing that Charles asked him so humbly, Sienna's emotions exploded like a volcano. He yelled, "If you king want to die, don't drag me down with you. You think that your stupid herb store is very amazing? Once you've offended Mage Felix, that herb store of yours also can't save that life of yours. You understand?" Charles was a man of status in Roland City. However, even though he was scolded right in his face by a junior who was only 20+ years old, he didn't dare to show any signs of discontentment. He had to put on a smile no matter what Sienna said and agree with a string of yes. It was indeed impressive to serve noble pharmacists. However, these pharmacists wouldn't help to escort Charles's merchant caravan. In fact, those pharmacists had paid for the herbs they bought from Charles, so they didn't owe him any favor. He had only spoken of his relationship with these pharmacists to elevate his status, but whatever path-blocking bandits wouldn't care about this. Charles had no other choice, he was the one asking for help. Only Sienna's mercenary corps was capable of providing this escort service. Charles had tugged many strings, and finally got Sienna to agree to accept this commission. Moreover, though Sienna was a warrior by occupation, he was Castellan Arthur's favorite. Be it ability or influence-wise, Sienna was not to be overlooked by a merchant like Charles. The harsher Sienna scolded, the more Charles felt afraid. He knew very well that Sienna's reaction revealed his innermost, uncontrollable fear. Fear, not caution. There was a big distinction between the two. If the person Charles had offended had been merely someone to be cautious of, Sienna would have asked Charles to be more humble and make peace between the two. However, Sienna was trying so hard to separate himself from Charles, fearing that he had the slightest connection with Charles. Who were those 4 mages dressed in humble clothes? How could they make Sienna so fearful? With these thoughts, Charles's face turned as white as sheet. His back was drenched in cold sweat. When he finally found a chance to speak while Sienna was taking a breath, he replied in trembling voice, "Captain Sienna, it's all my fault. Please don't be angry. Looking at our friendship in the past, can you please tell me the backgrounds of these 4 esteemed Mr. Mages so that I can die without doubt in my heart?" Friendship? Don't even mention this word. If I'd known that I'd be burdened by a stupid fellow like you, I wouldn't have agreed to this commission no matter what. I'm too damn unlucky. Sienna didn't want to care, but since he was already involved, he could suffer as well if things really reached an irreconcilable stage. So, for his own sake, he had to care. Captain Sienna. Charles looked at Sienna with pleading and bitterness, not daring to shift his vision an inch. Damn it, Charles. Listen to me very carefully. Sienna cautiously peered at Lin Li and his companions on the other side, and made sure his actions didn't displease that terrifying Mage Felix. He then clenched his teeth, and said to Charles, "Where's your wit? Why did you choose my mercenary corps out of all in Roland City?" "Because your mercenary corps is the best in Roland City. The difficulty of this commission is very high, and only your mercenary corps can ensure the safety of my merchant caravan." Charles quickly flattered him. "Good. Since you know that only my mercenary corps is capable of escorting your transport, do you know who I was a year ago? Do you know how I turned from an unknown mercenary to who I am now?" Sienna asked, sticking his finger close to Charles's nose. Charles didn't dare to step back. He forced out a smile and said, "It's definitely because of your capabilities, Captain Sienna. Stop putting on that stupid smile. You think I don't know what the others say about me? They say I got to where I am because of the Castellan's support. They are right, the Castellan supported me to my current position. But why did he support me? Many bards are reciting now that you've saved the Castellan's son and daughter from the hands of the sire bandits, cleverly together with your loyal subordinates. Merchants were all capable of speaking what others liked to hear. Charles had listened to almost all the versions sung by the bards in order to please Sienna so that he would agree to escort his caravan. Now, these bard songs were finally useful. What the F***king sh**t? Let me tell you, if I hadn't met Mage Felix, my brothers and I would have been beast sh**t by now. Save other people? You should know what an ice howler is with your knowledge. Sienna still shivered even now, when he thought of the incident that day. Ice howler? Do you mean the magical beast ice howler? Charles shivered. That was a terrifying descendant of the legendary ancient beast that had savagery flowing in the blood vessels of its body. Though Charles had never seen an ice howler before, many accounts had recorded its horror. Its incredibly strong muscles and inborn ice element magic made it a nightmare for anyone who chanced upon it. The most recent incredible information came from the diary of a soldier from Roland City. The diary recorded that a few years ago, Castellan Arather led an army deep into the Dragon Mountains to encircle the Sire bandits. However, their mission failed because they had encountered an ice howler on their way. Charles knew that not to mention Sienna a year ago, even if Sienna gathered all his powers now, he wouldn't be able to defeat an ice howler. So how did Sienna manage to survive the attack a year ago? Could it be? Charles thought of why Sienna told him this story. Was Mage Felix the one who'd saved them? Do you mean that Mage Felix defeated the ice howler? Charles asked in a soft voice, feeling incredulous. How could a 20-odd-years-old mage defeat the ice howler, which even Castellan Arather and his elite army couldn't overcome? No, Mage Felix didn't do it, replied Sienna, shaking his head. Hearing Sienna's reply, Charles heaved a sigh of relief. He thought that it was impossible for someone as young as Mage Felix to defeat the ice howler, given its terrifying power. Maybe Felix had used some trick to lure the ice howler away. After all, no matter how powerful the ice howler was, its intelligence couldn't be compared to that of humans. Charles's slight change in facial expression didn't escape the eyes of Sienna. Sienna sneered, the person who defeated the ice howler was Mage Felix's attendant. The one who caught Larry just now. Cough. Charles barely caught his breath. That pale fella had defeated an ice howler? What kind of joke was that? He had to have been mad to demand for Larry from that fella. Charles felt a gush of cold air behind his throat. If he had known that fella had defeated an ice howler earlier, he wouldn't have cared about that bastard Larry's life. What? Now you are afraid? Do you think this is all? Sienna looked at Charles with mockery, and slowly said, do you know what a humorous WYRM looks like? Do you know how powerful a lich that can summon a humorous WYRM is? Charles's body shivered more intensely as Sienna threw out more questions. Even the sound of his teeth chattering against one another was audible. Although Charles had never seen a humorous WYRM before, everything in this world that was associated with WYRMs had the common characteristic of being powerful. Charles didn't have a clear idea of how powerful a lich that could summon a humorous WYRM was, but the possession of a domain meant the abilities of legendary realm. In the eyes of ordinary people, legendary powerhouses were like gods. You mean, Charles couldn't believe it. According to what Sienna said, didn't it mean that the humorous WYRM and legendary realm lich were all defeated by that Mage Felix? That had to be a joke. Was it so easy to defeat a legendary powerhouse? How old was that Mage Felix? How could he defeat a legendary powerhouse so easily? Oh God, did he just defend an incarnation of a god? Was that bastard Larry dead by now? If he wasn't, Charles would kill Larry himself. Sienna wanted to tell Charles just that. Be it the humorous WYRM or the legendary realm Lich, all of them were defeated by Mage Felix, who was heaven-defyingly powerful. However, he glanced at Ujfalusi before he said so, and immediately decided to shut up. Nobody liked other people talking about their failures and defeats, even if the one who defeated him had become his master. Sienna didn't know if this was a taboo topic for Ujfalusi, but putting himself in Ujfalusi's shoes, he wouldn't want others to talk about it. Although Ujfalusi was already an attendant of Mage Felix, he could still kill Sienna easily at the snap of his fingers as a powerful lich. So, let me tell you. The one who saved Master Castellan's children is Mage Felix. He is also the one who protected my followers and me, bringing us back to safety. This Mage Felix is the real savior of the Castellan's children. Sienna decided to skip the part regarding Ujfalusi and let Charles figure out the details himself. Though Sienna didn't specify the fact that the humorous WYRM and the legendary realm Lich had been defeated by Mage Felix, wasn't it obvious, judging from the ending of this story? Charles suddenly felt his legs were shaking, and stumbled a bit. He didn't fall down only because he had held on to a cupboard. Charles felt very desperate. There were many other possible explanations to this matter. Maybe that Mage Felix only repelled the humorous WYRM and legendary realm Lich, maybe his teacher or some other person had helped him. But what was the difference for Charles? Charles had said that Felix didn't understand nobility. Wasn't that accusing him of being a lowborn? Damn it, he had to have gone crazy today. How could he have made such a silly mistake? Charles had managed the seven-leaf grass for so many years, and had never made the mistake of judging a book by its cover. The reason for making such a mistake was firstly because of his trust in his subordinate. Furthermore, he also didn't think that these four mages were very powerful. Next, he was unhappy that he had to put on a smile and compromise when making the deal with Sienna. Due to all these, he had forgotten about the principles he had always adhered to all these years. Unfortunately, this only time had brought him and his seven-leaf grass to the depths of despair. Upon knowing how powerful Mage Felix was, Charles looked at the four mages again. The more he looked, the more he felt they were incomprehensible. No wonder he couldn't recognize their abilities. If he had known it in the beginning, he would have gotten rid of that bastard Larry even before Sienna. That pale youngster was probably the one who had defeated an ice howler. Now Charles felt that the youngster radiated a powerful aura. One needed to know that the ice howler was a terrifying magical beast that even the elite army under Arather couldn't defeat. That rather thin and small mage's body also surged with magical waves. The fear that Charles felt because of him was comparable to that the previous youngster instilled in him. These two powerhouses would be treated like treasures by whichever factions they were put into. However, they were merely subordinates of this Mage Felix here. Regarding Mage Felix himself, Charles still couldn't accurately judge his abilities. He just appeared to be always polite and peace-loving, and always had a smile on his face. Even when Charles attempted to chase him away, he didn't seem to show the slightest bit of annoyance. At the start, Charles didn't feel anything. However, after listening to Sienna's introduction, he thought of several big shots he had interacted with before. They didn't show their true feelings on their face either. Charles naturally knew that such people were scarier, because he never knew when they would stop smiling and what they would do to him then. Charles knew that he could hesitate no longer. If he didn't hurry up and do something, things might reach an irreconcilable stage. He tried his best to calm down and bowed to Sienna very courteously. No matter what, Charles would have been in deep trouble unknowingly if not for Sienna's presence. After thanking Sienna, Charles walked towards Lin Li with a trembling heart. Charles used the most formal etiquette in Emerald World for the first time in his life towards this smiling young mage. He said, "Dear Mr. Mage, I apologize for being rude to you previously. I know that my apology is far from enough to make up for my offense. Thus, I am willing to receive any punishment as long as you can forgive me this time." After saying all this, Charles stood there with his head lowered, waiting for Mage Felix's decision uneasily. Every second was a torture for him. He was so nervous he could hear the beating sound of his heart. Sienna was equally nervous. Though he had scolded Charles harshly, he might still be affected if Mage Felix was really fed up. He regretted agreeing to Charles's commission and following this fool here. This was such an unexpected disaster. Meanwhile, Lin Li couldn't have cared less about this matter. After all, who would haggle over trifles with such weaklings? He just smiled, and said never mind to these two fellas who were so nervous they were going to faint. Charles couldn't believe his ears, but also didn't dare to ask again. How could he let the esteemed Mage Felix repeat his words? How much courage must that require? He only turned to look at Sienna, hoping that he would get a clearer answer from him. Charles, are you King Blockhead? Hurry up and thank Mage Felix for his forgiveness, Sienna yelled with annoyance. Charles almost cried. He had even thought of making the arrangements for after his death. He couldn't believe that a casual word from Lin Li made him feel like he had risen to heaven from hell. When facing a true powerhouse, he didn't even have the right to be angry at him. He was as insignificant as an ant in front of Mage Felix. Who would care about an ant's attitude? Could this be considered surviving a disaster? Charles felt very weak, but this wasn't the time to relax yet. Ants needed to know what ants should do. He forced himself to concentrate and put on an obsequious smile. He asked Lin Li, esteemed Mr. Mage, may I know what herbs you need? I have quite a lot of different herbs here. Please feel free to tell me what you need. Don't waste your time because of my mistake. Charles, is this a place for you to speak? Sienna reminded. He heaved a sigh of relief upon seeing that Mage Felix didn't really care about Charles's rudeness. Even Charles was let go, so Sienna would definitely not be punished. However, that fella Charles was really dumb. How could he talk to a big shot like Mage Felix without even offering a place to sit? Charles lost his composure after the consecutive shocks. Though he tried his best to concentrate, his mind was still messed up like a pot of glue. This could be considered an escape from death, after all. It was not wrong to say that he was still badly shaken. After Sienna's reminder, Charles quickly ushered Lin Li to the parlor on the second floor while apologizing for his rudeness. After everyone had sat down, Charles stood in front of Lin Li, his face full of flattering smile. He then asked again if Lin Li needed any herbs. Charles was quite confident regarding herbs. After all, the seven-leaf grass could reach its current status because of the wide range of herbs it offered. Be it rare herbs, growing on dangerous grounds, or cheap ones found everywhere, you could find them all in the seven-leaf grass. Charles's motto for his store was, for pharmacists to find everything they needed to make a potion in the seven-leaf grass. Of course, this only applied to ordinary potions. The potion formula that Lin Li had gotten from William had been lost since the Dark Age. It also contradicted many traditional pharmaceutics theories in use currently, and required some herbs rarely used in traditional potion formulae. Lin Li had surveyed almost all the herbs in the seven-leaf grass just now, but he didn't know if Charles had stored anything in private. Thus, he named a few herbs that he didn't have. Charles had originally wanted to make use of this opportunity to please Mage Felix. He had thought that this young and powerful mage only researched pharmaceutics out of interest, so he was at most a beginner at it. The potions he could make at this level required mostly common herbs. With the seven-leaf grass's abilities, he wouldn't put himself in an awkward position. However, after hearing Lin Li list the herb names one after another, Charles's smiling face turned bitter. The herbs that Lin Li needed were not only rare and precious, but also very seldom used in traditional pharmaceutics. At least since Charles had started the business of the seven-leaf grass, very few people bought these herbs from him. Although Charles wasn't learned in the field of pharmaceutics himself, he knew a little about the levels of herbs and formulae since he was doing herb business. He knew from the names of these herbs that the level of this formula wasn't low. This surely wasn't something a young mage could make. Maybe he knew a pharmaceutics master. After all, abilities determined status, while status determined the kind of social circle. With the abilities of Mage Felix, it wasn't impossible for him to know a pharmaceutics master. Lin Li saw that Charles looked troubled, and asked, "What? Is it difficult for you? Charles shivered, and explained, Dear Mr. Mage, it is indeed a little difficult. These herbs that you need are not only rare, but also seldom used by other pharmacists. Not to mention my place, even the tree of emerald in the city of late winter may not have it always sold. Is that so? Lin Li frowned. Not because of any displeasure due to the fact that Charles didn't have these herbs, but rather because of what Charles had said later, that even the tree of emerald in the city of late winter might not necessarily have it always available for sale. Lin Li, who had lived in the breezy plains for a year so far, had naturally heard about the tree of emerald in the city of late winter that Charles was talking about. As the owner of the Tower of Dusk and president of the Guild of Magic in the breezy plains, Lin Li had subordinates who collected all kinds of information about the breezy plains, despite being extremely busy the whole year and having little spare time himself. The city of late winter was a well-known city. Just like Roland City being called the City of Abundance and the Granary of the Breezy Plains, the city of late winter was named the City of Nature and Treasure House of the Breezy Plains. As the city of late winter was located at the border of the breezy plains, close to the Elven Kingdom, it housed the biggest herb market in the entire breezy plains. In fact, the true treasure house wasn't city of late winter, but rather its neighboring Elven Kingdom, because the precious herbs traded in the market weren't produced in city of late winter. The Emerald Forest, where the Elven Kingdom was located, was also known as the Heaven-bestowed land. Legend had it that the goddess of nature, ManhwaRecap, had bestowed that fertile land to the elves. In the endless stretch of Emerald Forest, almost all the herbs pharmacists needed, excluding those that grew under extreme conditions like the black lotus, could be found. The quality of these herbs was also much better than those found in other places, so the Emerald Forest could definitely be considered a vast and fertile land. There had been a joke circulating in the circle of pharmacists, claiming that one could judge the success rate of one's potion by checking what proportion of herbs originated from the Emerald Forest when one made a certain potion. Of course, this was just a joke. The major factor that determined the success rate of a potion wasn't the quality of ingredients, but rather the abilities of the pharmacist. However, the quality of ingredients used still largely affected the final quality of the potion. Thus, herbs from the Emerald Forest were very popular among pharmacists. Other than herbs, the Emerald Forest also had all kinds of animals, but due to the respectful attitude the elves held towards nature, few of them would be sold. The only way to get them was through poaching. However, the consequence of poaching in the land of elves was no better than the fate of the animals poached. This was because in the forest, elves were the best hunters in the animal world, only that their prey weren't animals living in the forest, but poachers from the outside. Even for the collection of herbs, the elves had their own set of rules. Different sets of restrictions had limited the annual production. In fact, it was precisely the presence of the elves that allowed the Emerald Forest to continue producing precious herbs 1,000 years after the end of the Dark Age. Without the elves' protection, a forest 10 times bigger than the Emerald Forest would have been completely exploited by greedy humans. Actually, elves weren't the first inhabitants of the Emerald Forest. During the Dark Age, elves lived as the slaves of the High Elves. Though elves were similar to the High Elves in almost every aspect, even the names of their race, these names were only used by humans and other non-elven races. During that time, elves had a status even lower than humans, who were also controlled by the High Elves. The beauty and gentle nature of elves didn't bring them good luck. They were beloved by the High Elves, but the way High Elves showed their love for elves was by possessing them as their own slaves. Of course, losing freedom was still a little better than extinction, as elves were often close servants of the High Elves and had appearance that High Elves liked. Something that often happened in the human race became a common occurrence among the High Elves. The outcome of this was that the bloodline of elves and High Elves started to mix, and a group of elves with the blood of High Elves emerged. The truth was that how the High Elves and elves reproduced remained a mystery to many people. However, due to the strikingly perfect appearances of elves and High Elves, many speculations and wild guesses began to spread. After all, elves with the blood of High Elves really existed. There was even a rumor that said the current elf queen was the illegitimate daughter of the last queen of High Elves. Of course, this was just a rumor with no concrete evidence. After all, nobody dared to look for evidence, as he would be subjected to the wrath of all the elves. Elves were never friendly to humans even 1,000 years after the Dark Age. The dislike elves had towards humans was even greater than that of dwarves, those messy alcoholics. The reason for that, many knew, was that the appearance of elves made them desirable to humans as well. Towards the end of the Dark Age, humans, and other races, collaborated to oppose the control of the High Elves. Elves also made use of this opportunity to break loose from slavery. However, this wasn't the end of the elves' suffering. What they had to face was all the other races who had lost their sanity, overwhelmed by the joy of victory after defeating the High Elves. The overthrow of the High Elves signified the end of their cruel hegemony and the Dark Age. However, this was the real beginning of the Dark Age for elves. After defeating the High Elves, elves became the common target of all intelligent species on the continent. Nowhere in the whole of Amril was the elves' home. That was certainly the darkest period of elven history. Though the High Elves had restricted their freedom, they'd still ensured the continuity of their race. Other races, including humans, however, vowed to kill off the entire elven race just like what they'd done to the High Elves. Although there were some people who captured elves as playthings for humans, nobody dared to keep elves in secret, fearing the wrath of the whole Amril. During that darkest period, escape was the main problem to the elves. Yet, even the powerful High Elves couldn't escape the fate of extermination, so how could elves survive the attacks from all other races? As a result, there were only a few hundred elves alive during the most difficult period, barely surviving in the depths of the forest. For any race, a population of merely several hundred was already equal to extinction. However, due to the longevity of elves, which they were envied by every race including humans, the search for elves didn't end even after years of not discovering any new elf. Legend had it that the elves finally got the sympathy of gods after being driven to the depths of desperation during that period. The goddess of forest Manhwa performed a miracle, and granted a large piece of fertile land in the east of the breezy plains to the elves. She also bestowed upon them the ability to communicate with plants and animals, allowing them to use the power of the forest and nature. When the coalition of humans and other races finally found the tracks of elves in the Emerald Forest, they realized that the elves had become the most terrifying hunters of the forest, just as if they were possessed by gods. Of course, even with these abilities, the elves couldn't turn the tables facing such a coalition. However, there was hope as long as they didn't give up. The elves didn't have to wait for long. The conflicts among different factions escalated, ultimately leading to the collapse of the coalition when they were splitting up the leftover wealth of the High Elves. At that time, the entire Amril was torn by wars. Nobody was concerned about the 100+ elves in the Emerald Forest anymore. The elves finally had a chance to revive their race. The entire Amril faced a power shift among factions. Wars and exploitation continued between races and nations. Nations were built and destroyed. Peace finally arrived when an equilibrium was reached among nations. Elves only existed in legends, by then. Almost nobody could remember the hundreds of elves left in the Emerald Forest. Maybe this was because the elves didn't want to be reminded of the suffering they had been through during the darkest period. Or maybe it was because elves were optimistic in nature. They loved life and nature, and didn't want their descendants' hearts to be filled with hatred. Thus, new elves born after that catastrophe didn't know much about what had happened during that period, and showed their kindness to the wrong people. A beautiful elf had once helped an expedition that lost its way in the Emerald Forest. The team also got a lot of precious herbs from the elves. This news spread like wildfire throughout Amril. Each faction swarmed to the Emerald Forest, no matter if they were looking for wealth or elves. The peaceful life of elves was once again disrupted. The ones they were facing this time, however, were no longer an elite coalition of different nations. After so many years of plotting and scheming, different races could no longer form a coalition even if the High Elves were to appear again. Those factions that swarmed to the Emerald Forest wanting to get benefits were no longer faced with a weak and frightened population of hundreds of elves. They faced an elven kingdom over 100,000 strong, with each elf being an excellent hunter and mage by birth. Due to the constant harassment from the outside world, the elves knew that they could retain their peaceful lives no longer. Hence, they did what humans and other races had done. The Elven Queen announced to the entire Anril the founding of the Elven Kingdom. With the founding of a nation came the right to diplomacy. The internal management of the Elven Kingdom, however, was still the same as before. The rulers were still the queen and elders. There were no other governmental positions of any sort. After getting the right to diplomacy, the first thing that the Elven Kingdom did was to formalize its territory. The Elven Kingdom announced that any trespassing into the land of the Elven Kingdom would be considered an intrusion. The Emerald Forest was a giant treasure box. Nobody wanted to see it become somebody else's possessions, so the human nations were the first to oppose this decision. After knowing that the Elven Kingdom wouldn't back down, nations mobilized their troops and entered the Emerald Forest in order to force the Elf Queen to back down. But the truth was, the human nations no longer had the ability of the past coalitions, even though the elves were far weaker than the High Elves as well. Furthermore, the human nations no longer had legendary powerhouses like Apophis and Juresco. With their natural blessings and the blood of High Elves, the elves possessed amazing abilities that left humans in awe, not to mention their longevity, which left many races very jealous, including humans. The natural aptitude of the elves in magic came from their high elven bloodline. This allowed every elf to learn and use magic, unlike humans, of whom only a small proportion had talent for magic. However, the real obstacle that hindered the intruders weren't powerful mages, because the majority of the elves in the Elven Kingdom hadn't even reached adulthood. Even with their natural talent in magic, their magic wasn't powerful enough to defend themselves. For a typical army, bow and arrow were just secondary equipment. However, the combination of the bow and magic made for a very formidable weapon in the hands of the elves. Moreover, the elves possessed the ability to communicate with plants and animals due to the goddess of forest ManhwaRecap, as well as the natural terrain advantage, the Emerald Forest. Every elf was an excellent hunter. This meant that in Elven Kingdom, with a population of 100,000, there were 100,000 excellent hunters. Maybe the cold-blooded genes present in the bloodline of the High Elves were finally awakened. Facing the attack from enemies, the life-loving elves didn't hesitate to kill. Large numbers of human soldiers died under sharp arrows. Human corpses could be seen even outside the Emerald Forest. After many nations had suffered huge losses, they finally gave up the attempt to take down the Elven Kingdom by force, and expressed their intention to negotiate with the Elf Queen again. The details of the negotiation were unknown, but the truth was that the elves made their position as the masters of the Emerald Forest clear via their bows and arrows. However, with the negative example set by the High Elves, the elves weren't unreasonable. After all, they still voluntarily provided herbs for the outside world even with the entry into their land restricted. The advantage of doing so was not only the ability to exchange herbs for necessities which the Emerald Forest couldn't produce, but also to prevent themselves from becoming the common enemies of Anril again. Time had proven that such a change was necessary. Although it couldn't stop all illegal poaching and herb-picking activities, most people wouldn't risk their lives for herbs they could buy with money. Therefore, the well-known herb exchange market in the neighboring city of Late Winter appeared. The current Elven Kingdom was said to have a population of over 1 million. Although the quantity was still small when compared to big nations like the Felon Kingdom, the quality was comparable to any big nations. It was hard to imagine that the elves were only a few hundred in strength when they'd first reached the Emerald Forest. All this was attributed to the goddess of forest ManhwaRecap and described as a miracle. At the start, many people regarded this legend with contempt. However, this story had now become a topic of songs for the bards. What was the difference if it was true or not? Looking at the entire Anril, who had the ability to chase 1 million of elves away from the Emerald Forest? Precisely due to the close proximity to the Elven Kingdom, the city of Late Winter was named the Herb Treasure House of the Breezy Plains. The economy of the entire city was supported by the herb business, and the tax from herb exchange made up more than 80% of the city's total income. Among the many herb stores, the most famous and highest in standard was the Tree of Emerald that Charles had mentioned. As the biggest herb store in the city of late winter, Tree of Emerald was also known as the source of life. It was said that this was the only place in Amril where one could use money to buy lives. Lin Li would have scoffed at such a saying before he had traveled to Amril. However, the guru-level pharmaceutics knowledge in his memory had taught him that everything was possible in the field of pharmaceutics. Not to mention potion formulae which cured all kinds of injuries, even incurable symptoms like aging could be mitigated by formulae in Lin Li's memory. Of course, the difficulty of making such a potion which prolonged life, the ingredients required, and the price of such potions were all too much for an ordinary person. The Tree of Emerald monopolized almost 80% of the herb business in Amril. No matter how precious the ingredients were, they could be found in the Tree of Emerald. Of course, on the condition that one could afford them. The more precious and rare the ingredients were, the higher the amount they were sold for, naturally. It was said that a small amount of purple lotus flower pollen was sold at a whopping 5 million gold coins. The Tree of Emerald wouldn't have reached its current status, just selling herbs. Just like what Sienna had scolded Charles for, it was almost impossible to get the pharmacists to help in times of need no matter how big Charles's business was and how many pharmacists he knew. All Charles could do was to use such connections to elevate his own status. After all, the herbs were sold to the pharmacists, and they didn't owe him any favors. How was it a friendship at all? However, how did the Tree of Emerald manage to monopolize 80% of the herb business in Amril and reach its current position? Was it absolutely because of its abilities? The reason seemed to be that the Tree of Emerald possessed its own pharmacists whose standards were no lower than of those in the Pharmacists' Guild. There had always been various talk about what background the Tree of Emerald had. However, there was one speculation that was most commonly acknowledged by people. That was, the Tree of Emerald was supported by the Elven Kingdom. Other than its name, this speculation stemmed from the fact that its herbs needed to come from a well-founded source for it to monopolize 80% of the herb business on the Amril continent. This was of course just speculation as nobody had ever seen an elf in the Tree of Emerald. When Charles spoke of the Tree of Emerald, he couldn't help but feel envy. The Tree of Emerald could be considered a role model in the herb business. Yet, everyone knew that it was almost impossible to accomplish even half of what the Tree of Emerald had. The biggest obstacle was the fact that most pharmacists were very proud. How could they easily work for others? Speaking of this, I heard that there's a newly established Tower of Dusk in Duland. I don't know why they were so lucky to get a batch of pharmacists to work for them. However, I've heard that many other factions were trying to poach these pharmacists. Seems like they won't be happy for long, said Charles with sparkling eyes. Oh, why not send some of your men to try too? Wilkinson, who had been quiet for a while, asked. He found it funny that his companions and he had been receiving so many presents these days. Charles laughed awkwardly, and replied, I know myself well. Those high-level pharmacists won't choose me for sure. However, Captain Sienna, I think you can give it a try with your abilities. In order to lighten up the atmosphere, Sienna half-jokingly asked, is it? Not to hide, I have been considering this recently. Charles, since you've interacted with pharmacists more, do you know what pharmacists like? Obviously, he didn't know that the owner of the Tower of Dusk was beside him. Otherwise, he wouldn't have made such a joke no matter what. Pharmacists like anything that's expensive enough. Only Lin Li could joke about pharmacists like this. He then asked Charles, those herbs that I wanted really can't be found here? Charles was rather unsettled as he looked towards Sienna, and hesitantly said, there's a way. I can find a way to find a few of the herbs you want, but... But what? Don't worry about the price. Tell me what other problems there are, said Lin Li. Charles didn't dare to make Lin Li wait, so he immediately explained, speaking of this, it's rather coincidental. A few days ago, I've gotten a batch of precious herbs from the Elven Kingdom via other means. A few of them are what you want. However, it is very dangerous and difficult to transport those herbs safely from the Elven Kingdom. Thus, whether this batch of herbs can be transported here safely depends on Captain Sienna's help. Sienna scolded the bastard Charles for involving him in this. However, he didn't show any signs of displeasure, and nodded. Indeed. The path from the Elven Kingdom is very long, and there are several dangerous locations which we must pass by. Especially recently, I've heard that a batch of high-value magic staff material from the Lude Magic Equipment Store was robbed. The second master of the Holly family in the Eastern Plains, who was in charge of the escort, was also kidnapped. The Holly family had not only lost all their goods, but also spent a large sum of money to ransom him. According to the ones who went to redeem him, this stretch of road is now owned by the Gale Bandits. Everyone in the Breezy Plains knew about the Gale Bandits. With abilities only below the Dark Blades and placed second on the so-called top 10 bandits ranking of bandits in the plains, the Sire Bandits who'd placed 10th on that list couldn't match the Gale Bandits at all. Of course, that was talking about Vanscore's Sire Bandits, without the allies which joined in later. Some speculated that there was at least one legendary powerhouse leading the Gale Bandits. However, there was no way to prove this speculation right or wrong. The truth was, the Gale Bandits had been rife in the Breezy Plains for years, and many missions had been dispatched to destroy them, including teams which were no short of powerhouses, yet all of them failed in their mission or contact with them was lost. Though the Dark Blade was the top in the top 10 bandits rankings, it almost didn't engage in any robbing activities now. The true top bandits in the Breezy Plains were in fact the Gale Bandits. The room was silent after Sienna mentioned the Gale Bandits. Charles already knew that he was nothing in the eyes of Mage Felix, so his fear had subsided quite a bit. This was because he knew that as long as he did what he needed to do obediently, Mage Felix couldn't be bothered to find faults in him. Merchants were merchants. Upon knowing that he needn't worry about his life, Charles immediately started worrying about his business. He had put a lot of money into this collection of herbs from the Elven Kingdom. If it was robbed by bandits halfway, it would immensely affect the business of the seven-leaf grass. He didn't have to worry about this if he directly sold them in the city of Late Winter, but that meant that he would only be able to earn very little. In fact, Charles didn't have any hope upon hearing the Gale Bandits that Sienna talked about. Everyone knew that the Gale Bandits were only second to the Dark Blade. Judging from Sienna's mercenary corps' abilities, it was almost impossible for them to protect Charles's merchant caravan from the Gale Bandits until it reached safety. How could Sienna be unsure of something even Charles knew? Though Sienna led the so-called biggest mercenary corps in Roland City, it was nothing compared to the Gale Bandits. He had the chance of succeeding only if he used all his men, and the Gale Bandits didn't send in a big force on this path. However, Sienna didn't want to risk his everything betting on a possibility. If he bet wrong, he would lose everything he had. Therefore, he would definitely not walk this path, despite agreeing to Charles's commission. Mercenaries weren't fools, they would only risk their lives if there was a chance of winning. Against the Gale Bandits, the chance of winning was close to zero. Meanwhile, Lin Li didn't seem to be listening. He gently rubbed his chin, and said, "How about this? You see if you can get some other herbs I need. If you can get them, I can transport them back together." Then, he told Charles the names of a few other precious herbs. Didn't Mage Felix hear Sienna talking about the Gale Bandits? Charles was confused, but he didn't dare to ask. What he had planned was to sell those herbs cheaply at the city of Late Winter. Since the Gale Bandits were the ones blocking the way, he didn't have high hopes of transporting his herbs safely back to Roland City. Though he might lose some money this way, it was better than losing everything to the Gale Bandits. Though this Mage Felix and his two attendants seemed to be very powerful according to Sienna, Charles didn't think he could get Mage Felix to help with escorting his merchant caravan. Even if Mage Felix was willing to let his attendants follow his caravan, it was still hard for 1 or 2 level 17 or 18 powerhouses to protect them. Though Lin Li's attendant could defeat an ice howler single-handedly, how many could they kill by themselves when faced with thousands of bandits? When they were occupied by some of the bandits, others could easily ransack the entire merchant caravan and escape. Moreover, it was said that the Gale Bandits had at least one legendary powerhouse as their leader. Even if that wasn't true, there had to be a few level 17 or 18 powerhouses. If not, the Gale Bandits wouldn't be placed second on the rankings. Charles looked at Sienna, signaling him to explain to Mage Felix that he couldn't do such a thing. After all, Sienna was closer to Mage Felix. Sienna knew what Charles meant. He cleared his throat and prepared to explain to Lin Li about the capabilities of the Gale Bandits, despite his fear. Will 10 archmages be enough? Lin Li asked Sienna in a low voice after a moment of contemplation. Sienna swallowed his words before he could even start upon hearing what Lin Li had said. What did he mean by asking if 10 archmages were enough? Although Sienna wasn't a mage, he still knew quite a bit about mages as an occupation. It was hard to be a mage, and even harder to level up in the study of magic. Every stage and its obstacles blocked the footsteps of a batch after batch of mages. Therefore, archmages could be considered the top of this occupation. Any archmage would be deemed an important existence in any faction. What did Mage Felix say just now? 10 archmages. Levels existed in any occupation, but similar levels didn't mean similar combat prowess. Mages above level 15 were archmages, but a level 15 warrior was incomparable to a level 15 archmage in fighting ability. So, one couldn't necessarily be able to recruit an archmage even if he could recruit a level 15 warrior. The presence of an archmage could drastically change the power of a faction. Sienna's desire to get an archmage was as strong as any other faction's. However, with his current abilities, it was very hard for him to recruit any. That Mage Felix could recruit 10 archmages at once? If that was true, he didn't have to worry about this escort even with the presence of the Gale Bandits. 10, Charles swallowed. He was really grateful that Sienna had scolded him just in time. If not, he wouldn't have known what a big shot he had offended. What kind of ability was needed to recruit 10 archmages at once? The Manhwa families? The Dark Blades? Even these two powerful groups in the breezy plains couldn't send 10 archmages to escort a merchant caravan so easily. Charles was exhilarated after recovering from his shock. He wasn't close to Lin Li yet, but he was already starting to get some benefits. No wonder getting to know big shots meant an opportunity to develop. Charles couldn't imagine how powerful 10 archmages would be. Although he wasn't sure of the power of the Gale Bandits, he firmly believed in the ability of 10 archmages to escort his goods back to safety. What Lin Li was the most concerned with was how to get the herbs he needed without accidents. He didn't really care about what Charles or Sienna thought. The Gale Bandits, despite being second to the Dark Blade in power, were definitely a force to be reckoned with. Thus, Lin Li said to Sienna, "How about I let Ujfalusi go with you?" Sienna suddenly had the urge to vomit blood. How could he be unsure of Ujfalusi's abilities? He could still vividly remember what had happened back at the ruins of Sire Town. Humorous Wyrm and legendary Lich, their power was sufficient to destroy an entire city. Add in the 10 archmages, and this was totally bullying. A caravan escorted by such a team wouldn't have to fear even if everyone belonging to the Gale Bandits attacked them. Seeing the weird expression on Sienna's face, Charles was rather puzzled. Who was Ujfalusi? How could he make Sienna so shocked? Sienna didn't have such an expression even when Mage Felix mentioned the 10 archmages. Seeing Charles's confusion, Sienna's mouth twitched, and he softly said, "When rescuing the Castellan's daughter," and he became Mage Felix's attendant. He was the one. Although Sienna didn't tell him the whole story, Charles associated this with what Sienna had scolded him for earlier. An immense fear flowed through his veins. A lich. Legendary lich. Being Mage Felix's other attendant. Charles yelled uncontrollably in his heart but didn't even dare to look Lich Ujfalusi in the eyes. Undead creatures were terrifying to anyone. How is this? If not, how about increasing? Lin Li wanted to propose activating the 4 alchemy colossus. One should know that a Titan-level alchemy colossus needed not fear even a legendary powerhouse. However, Sienna couldn't withstand any more shocks. Before Lin Li could finish his sentence, Sienna said, "That's enough, Mage Felix, that's more than enough." The owner of the 7-leaf grass Charles was already stunned beyond his wits. Shock, surprise, joy, fear. All kinds of emotions gushed from his heart. Sigh, are you stunned again? Sienna's voice rang beside his ear. Charles felt someone nudging him, and suddenly came back to his senses. Only then did he realize everyone had already stood up. Ah. Dear Mr. Mage, I am terribly sorry. Charles immediately started apologizing to Lin Li, and looked at Sienna for help, hoping that Sienna could remind him what he had missed out on just now. Mr. Wilkinson, here, needs some herbs. Your manager had spoiled the deal just now. How about you go take them yourself, remarked Sienna mockingly. Charles didn't dare to hesitate, and immediately asked Wilkinson what herbs he wanted. Though he really wanted to butter up to Wilkinson, he didn't dare to suggest giving him any discount or free gifts. However, after knowing the names of the herbs he wanted, Charles hated that bastard Larry even more. Being the boss of 7-leaf grass, Charles was very clear of the prices of each herb. He calculated in his mind and realized those herbs only cost 2,000 plus gold coins. However, that bastard Larry had asked for 20,000 gold coins just now. Damn it. How Charles wished that bastard Larry wasn't dead from Sienna's kick. How could Charles vent his anger now? After going downstairs, Charles personally packaged all the ingredients needed while cursing that bastard Larry who had almost put his life at stake secretly in his heart. Although Lin Li didn't get all the herbs he needed, he had secured a portion of them. With Ujfalusi and 10 archmages' presence, he believed that the Gale bandits wouldn't be a problem. Lin Li was pretty satisfied with this trip, and didn't want to waste any more time here. Right. Inform me at the Tower of Dusk when you've decided on the date to go. I will send Ujfalusi and the archmages over then, Lin Li said to Sienna and Charles when he reached the doorstep. However, Sienna and Charles, who had sent Lin Li and his companions off to the doorstep, were dumbfounded. They could only turn their abnormally stiff necks and stare at each other with fear long after Lin Li had disappeared from their sight. Oh God! Did he just say the Tower of Dusk? Charles almost fainted. Was he talking about the Tower of Dusk, which just recruited a large number of high-level pharmacists? If you're enjoying my content, please consider donating a coffee. Or checking out my shirts on TeePublic. I should have thought of it earlier. At Dooland, it isn't surprising to recruit pharmacists with such abilities. Tower of Dusk, Guild of Magic, Sienna was at a loss for words. Although he had worked with Lin Li once, Lin Li didn't mention anything about the Tower of Dusk, and said little about the Guild of Magic. Sienna didn't take this to heart, since it was common for mages to mention the Guild of Magic. However, how could he not think of the Guild of Magic after knowing Lin Li's abilities? Did we talk about pharmacists just now? Charles's voice was obviously shaking. He still couldn't believe that the one who stood in front of him was the owner of the Tower of Dusk, president of the Guild of Magic and the mastermind behind recruiting so many pharmacists. Yes. Sienna nodded stiffly. His tone was rather sympathetic, and he said, "You even said that the Tower of Dusk won't be happy for long," and asked why I didn't join in poaching. Charles's face turned pale. He seemed to be inches shorter. He replied, "Yes, you also asked me how to please the pharmacists, saying you were preparing to give it a try." Sienna looked afar and forced himself to stay composed. He said, "I know that a big shot like Mage Felix wouldn't mind my words, since he had even forgiven your rudeness." Upon leaving the 7-leaf grass, Lin Li wasn't interested in walking around Roland City anymore, so he brought Wilkinson and other companions back home. This wasn't because that manager of the 7-leaf grass had ruined his mood, but because Roland City was rather dull in the eyes of Lin Li. Though this world was considered bustling, it was nothing compared to the metropolis Lin Li had seen before. Back at the luxurious castle, those extremely bored pharmacists crowded around curiously upon seeing Lin Li's return. Of course, they didn't dare to waste Lin Li's time, so they bombarded Wilkinson with questions. Lin Li returned to his room and reminded the undead servants not to let anyone disturb him. He then closed the door and started doing what he had always done at the Tower of Dusk. He retrieved the Book of Eternity that Juresco had left behind from the Ring of Endless Storm and read it attentively. The greatest gain from the trip deep into the abyss of Tharlan in the Blackstone Mountains was not the Throne of Darkness, but rather the 3 items left behind by the late Juresco Lin Li had gotten from Tutankhamun: a key, a magical crystal, and a book. It was hard to say which of the 3 items was more valuable, but any one of them was more valuable than the Throne of Darkness. The key was for opening the 7th sky castle of the High Elves. Nobody knew how Juresco had gotten hold of it, but no doubt the absence of the 7th sky castle during the war had played an important role in ending the Dark Age. Maybe the power of the missing 7th sky castle was still a mystery for most people, but Lin Li clearly understood how terrifying it was because he possessed a blueprint of a sky castle. From this sky castle blueprint, Lin Li had a clear idea of how powerful a sky castle was despite never experiencing the Dark Age and seeing a sky castle himself. Compared to the sky castle, the eternal furnace that High Lord Osric had built was like a child's toy. Although Lin Li planned to follow Kanora's suggestion and integrate the Throne of Darkness with the eternal furnace, its power was still limited and incomparable to the powerful 7th sky castles. However, Lin Li was quite eager to know what it would be like after the natural magical domain from the underground palace had integrated into the eternal furnace. Could that create an 8th sky castle? However, no matter how powerful the sky castle was, Lin Li couldn't gain much from it now. Out of the 3 items, the ones that had constantly benefited Lin Li were the other 2, the magical crystal of the Evil Eye Tyrant and the Book of Eternity made from Leaves of Eternity. The Evil Eye, that was good at mental spells, possessed extremely strong mental strength. An accessory made from an Evil Eye magical crystal using special processing techniques could increase the mental strength of the wearer, though it couldn't provide mages with powerful magical strength. The degree of mental strength was often used to judge the talent and potential of a mage in terms of magic. This was because it was very hard to increase mental strength through any kind of training. Thus, it was almost impossible to change a mage's magical potential. Some people were destined to be mage apprentices for their entire lives, while others could easily reach the sanctuary realm. All this was determined by the degree of mental strength. Hence, nothing was more important to a mage than mental strength, and nothing was as attractive to mages as the Evil Eye magical crystal, which could increase one's mental strength. If there was any, it had to be this magical crystal of the Evil Eye Tyrant owned by Lin Li now. The magical crystal of the Evil Eye Tyrant had far greater effect on increasing mental strength than any ordinary Evil Eye's magical crystal. Even the most ordinary mage apprentice could at least become a level 19 archmage with the presence of a magical crystal of the Evil Eye Tyrant. Moreover, his mental strength would be far greater than that of other archmages. However, one could not simply put it close to the chest for the magical crystal of the Evil Eye Tyrant to show its greatest effect. There was a special occupation in Anril for that, just like pharmacists, blacksmiths, and inscribers, who were well respected by powerhouses despite being weak in strength. They were the crystal sculptors who could make magical accessories. One should not think that someone who merely made a ring or embedded a gem could be considered a crystal sculptor. Crystal sculpting required the arrangement of different ingredients and different carving methods for different gems and magical crystals, and even involved the use of the mageweth and potions. It was not wrong to say that the occupation of crystal sculptor was extremely profound, and not as straightforward as pharmaceutics or inscription. If this magical crystal of the Evil Eye Tyrant were taken by Hutton or Stephen, they probably wouldn't know how to use it. If the crystal was processed by an ordinary crystal sculptor, it would be a blessing if even half of its power could be unleashed. If they were unlucky, they might even destroy this magical crystal. However, it was different in the hands of Lin Li. If the crystal couldn't even be processed by a crystal sculptor master, then nobody could possibly process it in the entire Anril. Yet Lin Li had an advantage that a normal crystal sculptor master didn't. He was also a pharmaceutics guru, guru of inscription, and blacksmith guru. The magical crystal of the Evil Eye Tyrant was the size of a palm when he'd obtained it. Only with special master-level potions did Lin Li manage to shrink the crystal until the size of a pea without damaging it in any way. Ordinary crystal sculptors couldn't do this. They could shrink a magical crystal by half at most, but how could a magical crystal half the size of a palm be used to make accessories? The metal used to make rings was also better than the others. It was one of the treasures found in the Ring of Endless Storm, a metal brought from the other world. Even though it was said to be a treasure, the divinity metal wasn't a super rare commodity to Lin Li. After all, he was only using one of the 20 bars of divinity metal to make the ring. Lin Li had all kinds of metals stored in the Ring of Endless Storm. However, he had chosen the divinity metal as the material for the ring not because it was the most expensive, but because rings made with it wouldn't have additional properties. The magical crystal of the evil-eye tyrant only had one use, to greatly increase mental strength. Not considering this most important property, this magical crystal was even worse than a typical level 15 magical crystal. Therefore, Lin Li was only using this magical crystal to make an accessory that could increase his mental strength when worn. He didn't need any other irrelevant properties like attack or defense buff for something as precious as the magical crystal of the evil-eye tyrant. After all, Lin Li wasn't short of level 15 magical crystals. The value of the divinity metal was its growth property. Equipment made from the divinity metal seemed ordinary at first as it didn't have any striking properties. However, as time passed, the growth property of the divinity metal was revealed. During the growing process, equipment made from the divinity metal would increase the abilities of the user consistently. Thus, all equipment made from the divinity metal was likely to become an artifact. So, Lin Li chose the divinity metal and personally made a ring with fine magewef. The shrunken magical crystal of the evil-eye tyrant was embedded on top of the ring. After this ring was made, Lin Li always wore it. He seemed to clearly feel that his mental strength was increasing rapidly. The magical crystal of the evil-eye tyrant could make an ordinary mage apprentice quickly grow into a level 19 archmage due to its help in increasing mental strength. However, it couldn't guarantee that the user would reach the legendary realm with ease. This was because one needed not only the increase in mental strength and magic, but also understanding and grasp of world's rules in order to reach the legendary realm. The increase in mental strength could only help Lin Li increase his power. It wouldn't help with leveling up his realm. Hence, the magical crystal of the evil-eye tyrant still wasn't the most useful item for him out of the three. Be it the powerful 7th sky castle or the magical crystal of the evil-eye tyrant which could increase mental strength, neither and nothing was more useful to mages than the knowledge in their minds. This famous book of eternity was lost in Amril for more than 1,000 years until Lin Li obtained it, making many mages actively searching for it. Though nobody had ever seen the book of eternity before, based on the fact that it belonged to Juresco, many a legendary mage had announced that whoever held on this book wouldn't face difficulty in reaching the sanctuary realm. This was just a wild guess by people who had never seen the book of eternity before. However, Lin Li knew after he had gotten the book that although those people's guess seemed to be an exaggeration, the truth was more complex than that. The Book of Eternity could be considered the most complex magical book Lin Li had ever read. Before obtaining this book, Lin Li had speculated more than once what kind of content Juresco would write in his magical book. When Lin Li had flipped open the book for the first time after getting it from Tutankhamun, he finally knew that the contents of this book were very diverse. For 1,000 plus years, all kinds of speculations about the contents of the Book of Eternity existed. Even the most absurd and exaggerated guesses didn't cover 0.01% of its real contents. Anyone who had read the book would know that Juresco didn't rely on the slightest bit of luck to become the god of mages. He had achieved it through hard work. As a mage, Lin Li was concerned about magical spells the most. When he was at the small wooden hut of Tutankhamun, he had watched a battle between Juresco and an evil-eye tyrant through a spacetime beacon spell. During that battle, Lin Li had seen Juresco use a level 23 legendary magic spell, Starfall, but what he was more shaken by was the void of the stars which only existed in legends. There was no mage who had the slightest knowledge of the void of the stars now in Amril. Nobody even knew about the existence of that magic spell. Even knowledgeable people like Anduin could only find remnants of the void of the stars from legends. They only knew that was a realm only gods could reach. Legend had it that mages who mastered the void of the stars could entrust their bodies and souls to nothingness, and were no longer subject to any harm from earthly magic and weapons. How could Lin Li not be interested in such powerful magic? From the first time he had opened this book, Lin Li had been looking for information about the void of the stars. He didn't want to learn it immediately, though. After all, despite not knowing the exact level of this magical spell, he guessed that it wasn't something an ordinary legendary mage could accomplish. This kind of curious mentality wouldn't change with people or the level of ability a person had. The only thing that differed among people was whether they could control such mentality well. In fact, curiosity was not a bad thing. For any intelligent race, curiosity drove development. It was precisely curiosity that made people explore and learn. The act of learning magic, in some sense, was precisely for fulfillment of curiosity. Lin Li wanted to know how much Juresco knew about a magic spell like the Void of the Stars, which only existed in legends. However, he soon realized that he had never seen at least 90% of the magical spells recorded in the Book of Eternity before. These spells contained ancient dragon language, demon language, which Kenoris had mentioned, and even some Titan language. In contrast, the language of the High Elves and modern languages were rarely used in them. It was evident from these spells that Juresco was extremely knowledgeable. One needed to know that Kenoris had directly passed a paragraph of demonic runes to Lin Li with mental strength back at the Throne of Darkness in the Abyss of Tharlan. This had allowed Lin Li to break through all barriers and step into the legendary realm. However, the demon language was merely a small part in this book. Be it demon language, ancient dragon language, or Titan language, all of them pointed directly to the origins of power and core knowledge about rules. It wasn't surprising that people speculated that reading this Book of Eternity would allow a person to reach Sanctuary Realm effortlessly. Other than a large number of spells which Lin Li couldn't understand, the more important part of this book was Juresco's thoughts on magic. Juresco had handed this book to Tutankhamun because he wanted to create a powerhouse who could save humanity in time of crisis. Thus, Juresco had recorded his thoughts and experiences down to every magical spell, every word, every syllable, every way of mana distribution, and every kind of elemental sequencing. It was right to say that reading this Book of Eternity was like being taught by Juresco personally. However, everything that Lin Li could see was just a small portion of this thick book. Lin Li could see more blank pages than he could see words. Of course, Lin Li was aware that they weren't truly blank. He couldn't see what's written on those pages, because he hadn't reached the realm required to see those words. Though Lin Li had already reached the legendary realm, which most people couldn't, he was still far behind Juresco during his time. Lin Li knew that he could only get to see everything in the Book of Eternity when he had reached the same realm as Juresco. Since Lin Li had gotten the Book of Eternity, reading this book had become a daily task for him. Though he could only see a small part of it now, every sentence in this limited portion he could see was worth analyzing repeatedly. The room was exceptionally quiet. The thick Book of Eternity lay on the table, and its pages made from the leaves of the Tree of Eternity radiated a faint fragrance. Lin Li recited the contents on the book word by word, carefully inferring ideas and thoughts between the lines. Compared to Kenoris directly passing demonic runes to Lin Li's mind via mental strength, reading this book word by word and then coming up with his own thoughts had slowed down the process of learning. However, though Lin Li was able to rise to the legendary realm through obtaining Kenoris' understanding on that paragraph of demonic runes, his own understanding of demonic runes was still very much limited. Lin Li could possibly become a second Juresco with just passing of mental strength. However, if he wanted to exceed the achievements of Juresco, he needed to continuously accumulate knowledge by trying to understand and appreciate knowledge by himself in the long run. This way, there wouldn't be any limitations to the knowledge he had obtained. In addition, maybe Lin Li could even discover something Juresco had missed out on and work on it. Eventually, when Lin Li reached Juresco's level, he wouldn't be just another Juresco, but someone far greater than Juresco. Actually, this was part and parcel of human development. No matter how great the forefathers were, they all served to lead the way for later generations and build a strong foundation for their descendants to walk even further on the path of development. This applied not only to mages, pharmacists, blacksmiths, and all other occupations. All followed the same principle. This was the so-called inheritance of knowledge. More often than not, Lin Li had an illusion that Juresko was standing in front of him, answering his queries regarding magic when he read the Book of Eternity carefully. Whenever Lin Li encountered a difficult question, he could certainly find an inspiring paragraph in the book which would clear up all his thoughts. Stars hang in the night sky outside the window. The magic lamp in the reading room was already automatically switched on, and bright light illuminated the room. Lin Li was still reading the Book of Eternity with full concentration. He seemed to have chanced upon a difficulty. He frowned slightly, murmured a few syllables, and repeatedly chewed on the contents in the book. Suddenly, Lin Li's eyes lit up, and his murmurs became quicker as if heavy rain landing on leaves. With the sudden cease of recitation, Lin Li's brows relaxed, and a smile spread on his face. Lin Li could clearly feel that his comprehension of magic was deepened, which was brought by the resolution of one problem. He could vaguely sense that his true realm was close to level 21 now. The next morning, William came to the castle and personally invited Lin Li and his companions to attend the auction. When Lin Li's carriage had reached the city square of Roland City, the entire square was filled with all kinds of luxurious carriages. Although the carriages varied in design, they were arranged in an orderly manner, and didn't seem messy, despite the large number. Perhaps it was due to the tendency for people to compare with others. Even for a vehicle, the carriages were luxuriously decorated. It wasn't an exaggeration to say that a gem taken from any carriage would be enough to support an ordinary person for a lifetime. However, Lin Li's carriage didn't stop there, and drove directly into the courtyard behind the Elven Theatre. There were already some carriages stopped there, and they appeared much humbler than those outside. However, after some inspection, Lin Li knew that they were more expensive than the ones outside, which were adorned with gems. To ask an inscriber to inscribe ManhwaRecap for a horse carriage wasn't something that could be achieved with money alone. One needed to have sufficiently high status and power so that the inscriber wouldn't feel insulted. Among these carriages, Lin Li saw one that made use of alchemy arrays and even one that used magic gears. If the carriages outside were competing for money, then these carriages in the courtyard were competing for status. However, those mageways that the carriages used were too rough and rudimentary for Lin Li. The purpose of these mageways and alchemy arrays was no more than making the carriage more comfortable and less drowsy, or adding some defensive properties. The carriage that used magic gears, however, if it could even be considered a carriage, since it didn't even need to be driven by horses, made Lin Li think of cars which existed before he traveled to Amril. Unfortunately, it looked too unsightly, just like a plus-sized box. The owner of this carriage is Prince Hilary of the Leaden Kingdom. Prince Hilary's greatest interest was to find and recover lost technologies from the Dark Age. If President Felix is interested, I can help to introduce you to him, William suggested upon seeing Lin Li looking at the ugliest carriage. Lin Li smiled and shook his head. This kind of introduction was rather meaningless. That Prince Hilary could greet him a bit because of William's introduction at most and forget who Lin Li was immediately after. Moreover, it wasn't necessary, as Lin Li wouldn't need to deal with the Leaden Royals for a long time to come. Even in the unlikely case that Lin Li had to deal with them, he still had Inglos and Sendros. Lin Li could always ask them to introduce Prince Hilary to him when necessary. Juresko, who was known as the god of mages, had said something that was still regarded as the golden rule by all mages. Knowledge is the true faith of a mage. This sentence was written on the cover page of the Book of Eternity, which Lin Li was holding now. People nowadays couldn't imagine how difficult it was for humans to learn magic, and how much people desired knowledge during the Dark Age. Under the control of the High Elves, humans couldn't expect the High Elves to teach them magic, although learning magic was not forbidden for humans. Humans could only explore the misty realm of magic on their own, and record everything down in their own magic books. These books were then passed down generations after generations and perfected along the way. During that time, the typical items that a human mage had were a magic staff and a magic book. Even Juresko was no different. Now, Juresko's magic staff was housed in the Guild of Magic at Alana, shielding the guild from harm for over 1,000 years. The Book of Eternity, a book which recorded all of Juresko's findings in his lifetime, was now gently flipped open in Lin Li's hands. The pages of the Book of Eternity were made of leaves from the Tree of Eternity. The ink used in the book was the tree sap that Juresco had gotten from the trunk of the Tree of Eternity. The Tree of Eternity, which once supported the entire Anrel, had leaves and trunk that held more power than any ordinary person could imagine. The Book of Eternity made from these things contained so much power that it could easily be considered the most powerful magical weapon during the Dark Age. However, just like what was written on the cover page of the book, its value didn't come from its power, but rather the knowledge, experiences, and revelations the god of mages Juresco had throughout his lifetime about magic. This was the true priceless treasure to mages. Seeing that Lin Li shook his head, William was rather disappointed. However, he didn't say anything more, and led Lin Li and his companions to the front hall of the Elven Theatre. The massive front hall was filled with people who had arrived early, all waiting for the commencement of the auction and chatting with people they knew about various topics. Although some were sharp enough to spot William enter with another person, nobody dared to approach, as they knew very well that they didn't have the right to speak to William. At the same time, they were very curious about the background of the youngster who came with William, as it was clear that William was the one leading the way for him. One needed to know that even the guests of honor on the second floor had never received such treatment from William. After all, William was even respected by Castellan Arather of the Roland city. But now, this eminent William led the way for a youngster whom nobody had seen before. Perhaps even the king wouldn't receive such treatment if he were to come. Most people at the front hall were mostly leaders or representatives from the various factions. Some were from families with over 1,000 years of heritage, some were new factions that emerged in the recent centuries. Any one of them had power no worse than Sienna, yet they didn't even have the right to speak to William. Lin Li scanned his surroundings, and saw some familiar faces who seemed to have given presents to the Tower of Dusk's pharmacists. Were they here to present Wilkinson with gifts? Lin Li found it rather funny. On the second floor was a small but lavishly decorated hall. The ceiling sported a delicate magical crystal lamp, while the ground was laid with a lash purple sheep yarn carpet. All those elven-style decorations could probably only be otherwise found in the underground palace that Osric had built. There were also some people talking in this hall. There seemed to be more familiar faces here compared to downstairs. The Castellan of Dulan City led his son Lazaric to talk with Castellan Arather of Roland City joyously. That bastard Lazaric kept staring at Arather's daughter Yvonne, and didn't even want to move his eyes an inch. It was better this way. If not, heaven knew what fuss he would throw if he saw Lin Li. The president of the blacksmith guild, Master Garza, tapped on the shoulder of a bitter-looking young man with full strength. He spoke loudly and seemed to be saying some words of encouragement to the young man. The young man was full of despair, yet he didn't dare to show any displeasure to his father. "President Felix, do you want to have a chit-chat here, or directly proceed to your guest room?" William had wanted to introduce these people to Lin Li at first, but he rejected this idea once he saw that the Castellan of Dulan City had brought his son Lazaric along. Lin Li wasn't close to any of the people in this hall, to the extent that he would sit down and have a conversation with them. So, he greeted a few people and proceeded to the guest room with William. The guest room wasn't small at all. Lin Li had brought Wilkinson and a few other high-level pharmacists along, yet the room didn't feel packed at all. William explained, as if seeking praise, that his guest room was different from others in the sense that it was built for the king. How could the king watch a show alone? There needed to be at least a dozen attendants serving him. William didn't feel there was anything wrong with letting Lin Li use the VIP guest room. After all, just in the team that had followed Lin Li here, there were 6 high-level pharmacists. Moreover, those pharmacists were all very respectful to Lin Li. If Lin Li was just the owner of the Tower of Dusk and the president of the Guild of Magic in the Breezy Plains, William would not have lowered his stance so much. He wouldn't have done this even for the 6 high-level pharmacists. What made William do this was the fact that the existence of these 6 pharmacists meant that there was a pharmaceutics power comparable to the pharmacist guild out there. Moreover, how could a person these 6 high-level pharmacists looked up to be just a president of an ordinary guild of magic? William had witnessed the arrogance of high-level pharmacists before, and he knew very well that they wouldn't lower their heads even to typical legendary powerhouses. There was only one type of people who could gain their respect. Though William hadn't gotten the exact answer from Lin Li, he knew very well that this young mage was not simple. After Lin Li and his companions had been seated, William called for attendance personally. Delicate containers with precious fruits and drinks were served onto the table. It was right to say that in terms of service, William had used the highest standards, hoping that Lin Li wouldn't feel the slightest bit neglected. President Felix, please do tell them if you are unsatisfied with something. Now, please excuse me for the moment, William said politely. After all, he was the master here, and couldn't leave the other guests by themselves no matter how much he valued Lin Li. Lin Li waved his hands, unbothered. He didn't feel too shocked at such treatment. His mentality was now at the stage where the external environment could no longer affect him. Meanwhile, from the perspective of Wilkinson and others, Lin Li deserved such treatment given his status as a pharmaceutics master. After William had left, Wilkinson and other pharmacists made use of the time before the start of the auction to ask Lin Li questions regarding pharmaceutics. Nobody's success was coincidental. Though Wilkinson and the other pharmacists were more talented than ordinary people, they could only get where they were today because of their attitude to learn anytime, anywhere. Lin Li wasn't annoyed by Wilkinson and the other pharmacists' questions at all, even though he wasn't their actual teacher. After all, wouldn't life be better for him if their abilities were higher? Shortly after William left, the first floor got noisier. Those people waiting in the front hall started coming in. It seemed like the auction was starting soon. In just 15 minutes, the 2,000 seats in the main hall downstairs were all filled. As this was a theater, the side of the guest rooms facing the stage was completely open. Lin Li looked around, and he could see everyone in the other guest rooms clearly. Unlike the totally filled seats downstairs, the guest rooms were not even half filled. However, this didn't mean that William's auction would fail. It was because who could be a distinguished guest was dependent on their status, so there was no need to fill up the guest rooms for the sake of doing so. If the standards were put too low, the status of a distinguished guest wouldn't be that valuable anymore, and some might even find it insulting. Lin Li wasn't interested in the background of other guests, so he briefly scanned the surroundings and focused on the stage with closed curtains. This wasn't the first time William had organized an auction at the Elven Theater. However, unless the king came, nobody was allowed to use that special guest room. Yet today, it was obvious that the one seated in that room wasn't the king, but a very young mage. Due to spatial limitations, the people around couldn't really see Lin Li clearly. However, people who had interacted with Lin Li before, like Castellan Arather of Roland City and Blacksmith Guild's President Garza, found him rather familiar. Yet, they wouldn't have guessed that the one William deemed as so important would be the president of the Guild of Magic, which was established not more than a year ago. The curtains of the stage were slowly drawn back. William smiled and strode to the center of the stage. He bowed to all the guests, and started with an opening speech. He didn't say much, though, just some words of thanks and welcome. After his speech, he left the stage to the chief auctioneer, and the auction officially commenced. Meanwhile, as the organizer of this auction, William still returned to Lin Li's guest room. He knew that no matter how much power and potential the mysterious pharmaceutics organization behind the Tower of Dusk had, it was still established for no more than a year, after all. This auction that William had organized would be a great chance for the young president of the Tower of Dusk to get to know different people, since many factions within and without the breezy plains had come. William wouldn't waste any opportunity to build a closer relationship with the Tower of Dusk, so he came here right after making sure the auction could run smoothly. Lin Li wasn't too bothered about this. With the Tower of Dusk's current abilities, the so-called medium or big factions couldn't threaten the Tower of Dusk at all. However, since William had already come, it didn't harm to listen to him. William sat down beside Lin Li. Meanwhile, the first item had just been brought to the center of the stage. It was a rectangular box about half the height of a person. It seemed to be pretty old from its color and texture, and some patterns carved on it also seemed to be worn out. Looking at this rather shabby wooden box, those people seated downstairs who didn't have the auction book with them started to guess what might be inside this box. The auctioneer didn't make everyone wait for long, as this was only a starting item which didn't deserve too much time wasted on it. Opening the box, the auctioneer stepped back, and a beam of light shone on the contents. The audience gasped. In the open wooden box lay a set of dark gold dragon armor which shone with a peculiar light in the presence of the light. Without further introduction by the auctioneer, everyone in the audience recalled an incident from the distant past. When the Dark Age just ended, the coalition made up of every repressed race started to split up the fruits of their victory. However, everyone thought that they contributed the most, and nobody could convince the others otherwise. Hence, everything was resolved by violence eventually. After humans had gained control of large areas of Amril, people thought that the long-awaited peace had finally arrived. However, war erupted among the human clans. While the period dominated by the High Elves was known as the Dark Age, this period of war after the Dark Age was known as the Darkness Before Dawn. Of course, that period wasn't totally useless. As the saying went, a hero emerges from chaos. That war period was also when a lot of legendary heroes came into history. They had provided the bards with a lot of stories that were recited for over 1,000 years. The owner of this dark gold dragon armor on the stage belonged to that dark period in history. He was Duke Hedrick, who had defeated the Leaden Kingdom countless times, and defended the breezy plains for the Felon Kingdom. Now, many libraries in Doolan still hang an oil painting of Hedrick commanding in war. What he wore in those paintings was exactly this Twilight Dragon armor. Thus, although this Twilight Dragon armor had disappeared for close to 1,000 years after the death of Duke Hedrick, it still evoked memories of that period of history and legendary stories about its owner when it was shown in front of everyone. Duke Hedrick was one of the many legendary powerhouses loyal to the Felon Kingdom, and his abilities was about level 22. During that time, almost all legendary powerhouses were overshadowed by the god of mages Juresco. Duke Hedrick, however, was certainly an exception to the people in the breezy plains. After a person had reached legendary realm, he was in some sense considered out of the realm of ordinary people. Hence, ordinary people were like ants in the eyes of legendary powerhouses, and nobody would care about an ant's life or death. Though Hedrick was only a sword sage as a legendary powerhouse, and his abilities couldn't match that of legendary realm mages, he still had a very long life. Although the sanctuary realm seemed very distant, it was not impossible to reach if one was still alive. Hence, every legendary powerhouse valued his life even more than an ordinary person, despite their powerful abilities. Unless it was for irresolvable hatred, legendary powerhouses rarely fought till their lives were threatened. Unfortunately, the Duke of Hedrick encountered Rodhart, the condemned Retribution Knight, who almost destroyed the entire breezy plains. Rodhart made the level 22 legendary sword sage seem insignificant even though the two of them were both powerful. Although Hedrick relied on the Twilight Dragon armor to increase his strength by 1 level, he was still worlds apart from the level 25 Retribution Knight Rodhart. Actually, Hedrick could have avoided the battle at first. Although he was no match for Retribution Knight Rodhart, he could have still escaped death easily. However, not only did he not shun the fight, he even voluntarily battled Rodhart despite knowing that he was no match for him. He did that all for the sake of buying some time before Prophet Willan of the Brilliant Shrine arrived. The Twilight Dragon armor, famous for its impeccable durability, unfortunately did not protect Hedrick from Rodhart's attack. In fact, no armor would be able to shield its wearer from the eternal frost blade, regardless of how strong it might be. During that disaster in the breezy plains, Hedrick was not the only one at the legendary realm who had fallen. However, he was deeply remembered by everyone who still argued and discussed whether or not his sacrifice was worth it. The material used for the Twilight Dragon armor was not actually the scales of a real ancient dragon, but the body of a magical beast that descended from an ancient dragon. Dragons were amorous by nature, and there were plenty of them on the entire mainland. That magical beast was considered to be a pure blood that had descended from the ancient dragon. Its firm and hard scales were not inferior to those of the dragons. One of the most powerful attributes of the Twilight Dragon armor was that it could amplify combat energy, and Hedrick could use the boost to increase his strength from level 22 to level 23. The difference of one level was actually very significant, for it was enough to multiply his combat energy several times. That alone was an irresistible temptation for a warrior. Hedrick died after being stabbed by Rodhart's sword. Ever since then, the Twilight Dragon armor disappeared. Some said that Rodhart had absconded with the loot, while others said that Prophet Willan might have taken the armor away. There were also those who said that it might be hidden in the treasure vault of the Brilliant Shrine. In short, there were all sorts of speculations, and apart from the VIP guests who had obtained the auction catalog in advance, no one else had expected that the Twilight Dragon armor, which had been missing for nearly 1,000 years, would actually appear at this auction. I know that at the instant that the box was opened, there must have been lots of questions and doubts that arose within you guys. I can clearly answer everyone. Yes, this is Twilight Dragon armor, which had once been worn by Duke Hedrick, and had gone missing for nearly 1,000 years, the auctioneer said to the audience. The auctioneer's firm assertion caused a huge uproar amongst the audience. The showstopper of the auction turned out to be the Twilight Dragon armor, which had been worn by Duke Hedrick, and had gone missing for nearly 1,000 years. Apart from feeling astonished, everyone else was also feeling excited and curious. This is the Twilight Dragon armor that the Grand Duke Hedrick had used before. Red scales from the ribs of a dragon were used for the breastplate. The rest of the armor was made using the selected scales of the adult Twilight Dragon magical beast. The auctioneer paused for a while before continuing. Bidding starts at 200,000 gold coins. The auction begins. 210,000 gold coins. As soon as the auctioneer finished speaking, a man who had thick brown beard began calling his bid eagerly below the stage. Everyone began to get riled up. It's the captain of the Anglo mercenary regiment, comprised of 1,000 mercenaries, William said nonchalantly to Lin Li. He kept the introduction brief, because he felt that the captain was rather insignificant. Lin Li only nodded after listening to what he said. In fact, he was equally uninterested in the Twilight Dragon armor as he was in the captain. Although they were seated quite a distance away from the stage, Lin Li could see the texture of the Twilight Dragon armor very clearly. Although the first impression that most people would have of the Twilight Dragon armor was that it was a highly durable and strong armor made of scales, the scales were not made of metal, and were, in fact, natural ones of the magical beast. The durability of the scales on various parts of the body was also different. Lin Li could tell that the scales on the armor were only of middle-grade quality, and that those on the breastplate of the Twilight Dragon armor were not the scales of a mature Crimson Dragon. After all, the magical beasts were only descendants of the dragons, and were not pure-blooded. If it had really been comparable to the massive dragon scales, the designer wouldn't have opted to use the scales of a Crimson Dragon. The only thing worth mentioning was the armor's ability to increase the wearer's combat energy. However, the effects would be more obvious if the armor was donned by a powerful warrior. A level 9 warrior would at most have his strength increased to level 10 after putting on the Twilight Dragon armor. Only a legendary sword sage like Hedrick would be able to unleash the potential of the Twilight Dragon armor to the fullest and maximize its attributes. Although plenty of skills had been lost during the Dark Age, the world had undergone development for over 1,000 years, hence, the Twilight Dragon armor might not be able to entice legendary powerhouses. To put it simply, Lin Li felt that the Twilight Dragon armor was more of a collectible that lacked practicality. Although it had been a legendary level armor, it was now more suitable for level 15 to level 19 individuals. After calling his bid, the bearded man returned to his seat and looked around continuously because he knew that it definitely wouldn't be that easy to purchase the Twilight Dragon armor. A redhead who was seated in the front row raised his hand, and calmly said, 250,000 gold coins. 250,000 gold coins was not a huge sum for those who could be granted entry to the auction. However, the bearded man's face grew sullen while he glanced at the eye-catching redhead from behind. After much consideration, he patted his knees dejectedly, and decided not to stand up to bid. The redhead might not be too daunting to others, but the captain of the Anglo mercenary regiment, who was also from the Breezy Plains, did not have the courage to stand up to the strongest force in the east of the Breezy Plains, the Wolf Brothers Association, for fear of getting into a conflict. The Wolf Brothers Association was established by three brothers. The eldest brother, Kido, was a level 17 warrior, while the second and third brothers were a level 15 mage and level 16 bandit, respectively. Although their force had only been established for over 10 years, they had already secured a footing in the east of the Breezy Plains. Although all three of them were red-haired, that particular redhead was still recognizable from the back, and the bearded man could tell who he was. Unlike the other two brothers, who were less unreasonable, Sard could not tolerate anyone going against him. He was a level 16 bandit who was good at ambushing and assassination. When the Wolf Brothers Association had been just established, many of his opponents died under his dagger. 270,000. Although the bearded man was afraid of the Wolf Brothers Association, the Breezy Plains was huge, and there were plenty of other people who disregarded the Wolf Brothers, even though the VIPs on the second floor remained silent. 300,000. Sard continued to bid. He was not that silly to think that everyone was afraid of him, and that he could assert dominance over everyone here like he did in the east of the Breezy Plains. If he were to resort to other means to force others not to vie with him, he would probably end up angering William. Ladies and gentlemen, could you please show some sincerity? This is the Twilight Dragon armor that had been used by Duke Hedrick. Please don't insult it by increasing your bids by such pathetic amounts. I call 400,000 gold coins, one of the guests said, standing up while scanning the crowd. Although it seemed silly to call a bid of 400,000 gold coins, the bidder was rather shrewd. In the VIP room upstairs, William witnessed the scene, and smilingly said to Lin Li, "That man is Rickermay, the largest grain merchant in Roland City. Although he is a little bit snobbish, he's got good judgment." Indeed, 400,000 gold coins was a reasonable price for the Twilight Dragon armor. Any higher, and it would exceed the value of the armor. Anyone who called for a higher bid would either be desperate or just doing it out of spite. By calling a bid of 400,000, Rickermay was not only pleasing William, he also put himself in a risk-free position. It was no wonder that he was a businessman. 420,000. Someone else called for a higher bid. However, William actually didn't have to introduce him this time, because Lin Li had just heard his voice yesterday. Not knowing that Lin Li had already known Sienna beforehand, William started to introduce the latter to Lin Li enthusiastically. "You don't have to introduce him. We know each other," Lin Li said smilingly. "Oh?" William could tell from Lin Li's expression that he did not dislike Sienna. Suddenly curious, he began to recall that the Tower of Dusk was established at the same time that Sienna's mercenary regiment rose in Roland City, and could not help but wonder if the two of them were in close contact. 450,000. Sard exclaimed while shifting his cold gaze away from Rickermay before staring at Sienna, who had just placed his bid, though not in a threatening manner. The strong would not have to be afraid of the powerful locals. Not to mention, Sienna was not any weaker than the Wolf Brothers Association. Rickermay wiped the cold sweat off of his head. Sard's eyes, which resembled that of a venomous snake, made him feel a little frightened. Although he was fortunate to have been invited to the auction, he was only a businessman, after all, hence, he was afraid of the ruthless bandit. Sienna smiled radiantly while staring at Sard, and said, 500,000. While William was still guessing at the relationship between the Tower of Dusk and Sienna, the first item of the auction had already been sold successfully. In the end, the Twilight Dragon armor was sold for 500,000 gold coins. After the fanfare and congratulations that sounded around Sienna had died down a little, the second item of the auction was brought onto the stage as a small wooden box was placed on the display. Silence was restored, and everyone was looking forward to seeing the auctioneer open the box. The first item was the Twilight Dragon armor, which had gone missing for over 1,000 years. What would be the second? Everyone waited excitedly while waiting for the auctioneer to open the wooden box slowly. Inside it was a golden ring that was embellished with gems. "This is the ring that the senior jeweler Mr. Joanne has specially created for this auction," the auctioneer said loudly while showcasing the ring. Perhaps the ring was not as shocking as the Twilight Dragon armor, but everyone was still excited after hearing that it was created by Joanne. They shifted their gazes onto the ring that the auctioneer was holding while waiting for the auctioneer to introduce it in further detail. Everyone in the breezy plains had heard about the jeweler Joanne before. Hence, everyone would cheer and rejoice over every piece of jewelry that he created. In addition to being a jeweler, he was also the successor of the Faceti family of the Northern Plains and a level 15 archmage. Although the Faceti family was not as formidable as the Manhwa family, which had a legendary figure to support them, no one had dared to challenge their authority. The Faceti family mainly dealt in the pharmaceutical industry, while Joanne was the descendant of the founder of the Faceti family. He was currently the one who was the most likely to attain the level of a jewelry master. The gemstones that embellish the ring are high-quality sparks blue stones that have been meticulously polished to perfection by Mr. Joanne. The spiritual power of the gems has been maximized as well. It can be considered to be the jewelry piece of every mage's dreams. The auctioneer took the ring out of the wooden box and held it high above his head, allowing it to sparkle as light was reflected off its shiny surface. For a mage, the most important thing was magic and spiritual power. Spiritual power directly determined the development potential of the mage and the level of advancement that he could attain. Even a normal evil eye magical crystal was considered invaluable, let alone the crystal of the evil eye tyrant. The sparks blue stone also had spiritual power elevating properties. However, the difference was that the magical crystal would genuinely increase the mage's spiritual power, while the sparks blue stone would only strengthen the foundation of the mage. In other words, when one had equipped the evil eye magical crystal for a long time, the spiritual power of the mage would be improved and remain at a high level after it was unequipped. However, the mage would immediately return to his original state once he was away from the sparks blue stone. His spiritual power would also decrease back to the original level. Of course, the sparks blue stone was undoubtedly the best choice for mages in the absence of the evil eye magical crystal. Even a slight increase in strength would increase the power of mental strength and, subsequently, the power of magic. Hence, the auctioneer was not exaggerating at all. The auction for Mr. Joanne's masterpiece, the sparks blue stone ring, will begin with a minimum bid of 200,000 gold coins. The auctioneer placed the ring on a magic hologram projection device, which projected an enlarged image of the ring in midair. He then rotated it slowly to allow everyone to catch a clear glimpse of the beautiful and alluring sparks blue stone. Immediately after the auctioneer announced the start of the auction, the audience began bidding immediately. The bids increased from 200,000 gold coins to 300,000 gold coins, and then to 400,000 gold coins. When the bid exceeded 500,000 gold coins, the speed of the increment in bids began to slow down. After all, 500,000 gold coins was not a small sum. 650,000. In one of the VIP rooms on the second floor, someone placed a higher bid, which caused a huge uproar amongst the audience in the hall. However, there was nothing they could do, since all of the VIP guests were filthy rich, hence, no one dared to vie with them at all. The person who called that bid is a representative sent by the Dark Blade, the level 18 archmage Tedia. It said that their original heir, Stephen, had disappeared in the Blackstone Mountains, and Tedia is the one who has the greatest potential of becoming the next successor. The Manhwa family dared not disclose the incident that took place in the Blackstone Mountains, hence, even the well-connected William had no idea what had happened. Since the VIP room's open sides were facing the stage, Lin Li could easily see Tedia, the potential next successor of the Dark Blade, whose room was located at the side. There were 4 or 5 people in that room. Tedia looked to be in his 30s, and he looked malnourished, with his eyes sunken deep in his sockets. His mustache was rather neatly trimmed, however. A necromancer? Lin Li could sense his undead aura, which was similar to that of Ujfalusi. Yes, it is said that the Dark Blade has the support of the Darkness Shrine. Hence, it's not strange that there are a few necromancers among them. After all, they were in the breezy plains. William frowned slightly at the mention of the necromancers. 700,000, another person from the other VIP rooms yelled. William pouted his lips and shook his head. This is Prince Hilary from the Leaden Kingdom. Most of the people from the Leaden Kingdom believe in the doctrine of light. Well, they wouldn't get into a fight here. Lin Li looked over to see a middle-aged man who had a goatee, clad in luxurious and expensive clothes, sitting inside the room. He was holding a glass of red wine in his hands, while an alchemy puppet massaged his shoulders. When he noticed Lin Li staring at him, he raised his glass deliberately and put on a noble smile. Lin Li thought to himself, what a lame person. Isn't he afraid that the alchemy puppet might crush his shoulders? The alchemy puppet was way inferior to the alchemy colossuses that Lin Li had acquired in the Dragon Mountains. The alchemy puppet was at most level 10 in strength. Besides, alchemy puppets were usually byproducts of alchemists' work, which did not serve much of a purpose. 750,000. Tedia yelled. The highest price that an accessory made with the Evil Eye's magical crystal had ever been sold at was 800,000 gold coins. Although it was said that the Evil Eye was priceless, that did not mean that its value could increase too drastically. 780,000. Hilary exclaimed without hesitation. Silence filled the air in Tedia's room. It was not an issue of affordability, for 800,000 was peanuts to the Dark Blade. However, they still wanted to spend their money on something that was worth it. One would certainly be ripped off if they were too generous. 780,000. Is there a higher bid? 780,000 once. The auctioneer raised the gravel high in the air and continued to try and stir the audience. This is Sparks Blue Stone, the masterpiece of the senior jeweler, Mr. Joanne. Is there a higher bid? This ring can help increase magical attributes greatly, and the current bid is 780,000 gold coins. 780,000 twice. 850,000. Tedia yelled, no longer able to hold himself back. He even placed a bid that was 50,000 gold coins higher than the record price the Evil Eye magical crystal was sold for. Forget it, I'm not a mage anyway. You may have it, said Prince Hilary. Thanks a lot, then, Tedia replied, sounding a little angry. 850,000 gold coins was actually insignificant to the Dark Blade. However, he felt like he had been ridiculed because Hilary had deliberately made him place an absurdly high bid. After asking for the third time, the auctioneer slammed his gravel down forcefully to close the auction for the ring. The Sparks Blue Stone ring was then sold to Tedia from the Dark Blade at 850,000 gold coins. Upon hearing the gasps of shock, Tedia could not bring himself to be happy at all, for the guests' reaction simply meant that he had been ripped off. Although the auction was of a large scale, the items that would be put up for sale were not exorbitantly priced like Twilight Dragon armor and Sparks Blue Stone. The nearly 2,000 people below the stage were not just there to watch the auction, and William didn't want them to go home empty-handed either. Hence, he arranged for a few other items that were of poorer quality to be put up for auction. Although the average auction price for the items was about 800,000 gold coins, the process made everyone riled up. The items that will be showcased next are not included in the catalog, because they were added to the auction rather recently. The items come from a place that you often hear about, and in fact, most of you have probably visited it before. The auctioneer paused for a moment before removing the red cloth, and saying, they are magical potions from the Tower of Dusk. The auctioneer removed the red cloth to reveal the potions, which had been stacked like a pyramid. As the auctioneer said, the guests were indeed no strangers to the Tower of Dusk. Those who wanted to recruit senior pharmacists had all scrambled to the Tower of Dusk, while those who had not been there before had long heard of it. Hence, it was a well-known fact that there were senior pharmacists in the Tower of Dusk, and no one doubted it at all. Every row of the pyramid was of a different color, and the potions were obviously arranged from the lowest to highest grade. There were 16 crystal potion bottles in the first row, all of which contained some light green liquid. Since they were similar, they wouldn't be sold individually. The auctioneer grabbed one of the bottles and placed it in the middle of the stage. This is made by the pharmacists of the Tower of Dusk. It's an intermediate-level potion named the Blood of Nature. The auctioneer held up the potion in his hand, and said to the audience, "The effect of this potion is to quickly heal any damage caused by magic, and at the same time restore the body that had been weakened by the injuries. It's definitely a necessity for adventurers. Having a bottle of this healing potion is akin to having an extra life." The auction of the first bottle begins at a minimum bid of 20,000 gold coins. 20,000 gold coins was considered expensive for a healing potion. However, the people at the auction were no fools, and had immediately caught the main point after listening to the auctioneer's introduction. There was a huge difference between normal damage and damage caused by magic. Magic damage would leave some brutal magic elements in the wounded body which couldn't be removed by generic healing potions, thus making it difficult for the injury to heal quickly. The next effect of restoring the body's strength was even more attractive. Usually, the injured would have to rest for a long time after being treated with a regular recovery potion. Well, at least damage caused by excessive blood loss could not be healed that quickly. However, the Blood of Nature could restore the body, which was akin to giving the injured some of their fighting ability back during combat. Hence, the potion was definitely worth 20,000 gold coins since it could heal magic damage and restore one's health. Some people might think that the price of 20,000 gold coins was too expensive for a potion that could only be used once. However, it was akin to buying another life with money. Was 20,000 gold coins for an extra life still expensive? A shorter healing time was at least a better chance for one to escape, regardless of whether it could restore combat power or not. Everyone understood that. Hence, as soon as the auctioneer finished speaking, someone placed a bid of 30,000 gold coins, which was peanuts to them. The price surged quickly, and the potion was finally sold at a price of 100,000 gold coins. The following bottles were sold in packs of 2 or 3 bottles. At last, they were sold together in a pack of 6 for a price of 700,000 gold coins, which made William feel rather emotional. Out of all the potions, Blood of Nature was of the lowest grade, and they were just the products of the pharmacist's practice sessions, to Lin Li. Thank you for watching Mystic Realms Recap. Please like, share and subscribe. Have a great day.